after today's episode, you will never look at sheep the same way again. Welcome to the In-Between, where we dive deep into stories of the strange and mysterious. Grant is a full-time park ranger for the British National Trust. Established almost 130 years ago, the National Trust is the largest heritage conservation society in the United Kingdom, and its job is to look after places of historic significance or natural beauty across the country. And this includes everything from historic houses and buildings to national parks. And since Grant grew up in County Down in Northern Ireland, his career as a park ranger inevitably saw him posted to the Mourne Mountains. The Mourne Mountains actually include a few different forests and parks that come together under the jurisdiction of the National Trust. But since they're all in an area that's only about 50 miles across, they're all under the domain of Grant's team. And not only has he been a ranger in the area for years, but he was born and raised just north in the town of Lurgan and also did his training around the Mourne too. He knew that area like the back of his hand. So by the time he actually becomes a ranger, everyone on his team knows that he is the go-to guy for expert advice on the Mourne Mountain terrain, which is how he ends up getting a phone call early one morning from a colleague, let's call her Julie, in need of assistance. Julie had gotten a call from someone she described as a very upset camper who'd woken up at dawn to find a couple of dead sheep outside of his tent. And since it's oddly not all that uncommon for sheep to turn up dead for a multitude of reasons, Grant didn't really think a whole lot about it. Julie calls Grant because she needs his help to actually find the guy's campsite. Grant says, well, sure, but why can't the guy just lead you there himself? Julie says, it's not that he can't go back, it's that he won't go back. He is terrified. This really piques Grant's interest. Waking up to dead sheep in front of your tent wouldn't be how most people would choose to wake up, but he doesn't understand why the camper is so afraid. So afraid that he refuses to even go back to the campsite and pack up his stuff. Wow. So Grant starts off to try to find this guy's campsite. And Julie gave him a vague idea of where the camper spent the night, enough for a rough starting point, but this guy didn't pitch his tent at a marked campsite. That would have been way easier. This guy decided to go wild camping, or rambling as some people call it, basically pitching a tent in the middle of nowhere, which means there's very little to go on in terms of location aside of, near such and such's field. As Grant's driving around, he gets Julie back on the phone again, who's still with the terrified camper down at the Mourne Country Park office. And he basically says, I'm gonna need more to go on. The camper says, after waking up to that horrific scene, he basically just ran all the way from his campsite to the Mourne Country Park. That's about 7 miles. And Grant asks, why didn't he just call somebody from his campsite? But the camper said he'd been so terrified that he didn't bother to grab anything before running for his life. At this point, as he's driving around on speakerphone, Grant starts wondering just how many dead sheep it takes to scare somebody who's apparently well into middle age. This guy isn't some scared kid. He sounds older than Grant. So Grant tells Julie, ask him exactly how many dead sheep were outside his tent. The reply came back, he doesn't know. The guy can't even guess. He only adds, it's a mess up there, and that Grant should take a gun of some kind with him if he's going to be the one investigating. And Grant only overheard that last part because Julie didn't even think it was worth repeating. Being a park ranger in Ireland is way different than being a park ranger in America. National park staff in Ireland never carry guns and don't even have any access to them. They just don't have any really kind of crazy wildlife that would require that kind of protection. So some guy saying that he needs to take a gun with him just sounds like insanity. Grant finally ends up talking to the camper directly and says, I need you to describe your campsite to the best of your ability, every detail. And the camper tries his best, but nothing in his description clicks with Grant until he mentioned how on his first day, he walked past a large body of water that was kind of in a C shape. And Grant thinks for a moment. The only large reservoir in the Mournes shaped like that is the Spelga Dam. The camper says he pitched his tent only 5 or 10 minutes away from the water. Bingo! That narrows the search quite a bit. Then Grant starts thinking, if I were to camp near Spelga, where would I go? And he decides to drive over and check out the only 2 places that come to mind. Now, the first one is a dud, but the second one is a direct hit. Grant can see a bright red tent sitting inside the tree line up ahead. The camper had chosen to camp among some trees, meaning that Grant can't see much from a distance, dead sheep included. So he starts trudging across a muddy field and hops a fence before he finally gets a good look at what has terrified the camper. And wouldn't you know it, it terrifies Grant too. From what he can see, the reason why the man couldn't tell the number of dead sheep is because there are bits and pieces of wool, flesh, and bone strewn all over the campsite. It shakes Grant to his core. He has never seen anything like it, not just during his ranger career, but ever. He has to count the sheep's skulls, or at least what he guesses are the remains of the skulls, to get an accurate number. 4. He counted 4 eviscerated sheep around that man's campsite. No wonder he'd been so terrified. Imagine opening your eyes in the morning, seeing the morning sun shining through the tent walls, having a good stretch before crawling out of your sleeping bag and unzipping your tent, only to see blood and bones and guts everywhere. Grant considers himself quite hardy when it comes to things of this nature. But good Lord, even he was having a bit of a problem with the grisly display in front of him. Grant then contacts another ranger and tells them exactly where the campsite is and asks them to lock the place down so they can secure the scene. It may seem kind of like overkill going all CSI on a few sheep, but in this case, they have to do something to preserve the evidence. It's the only chance they're going to have to figure out what happened. Now, once Grant knows that is in the works, he starts heading back to Mourne Country House, where there's a little porta cabin in the parking lot that serves as the ranger station office. Time for a serious chat with the frightened camper. When he arrives, the guy's still freaked out, so he starts asking the guy some questions. But he goes pretty easy on him since he figures out that he'll get most of what he really needs to know from the scene itself. But he has to ask, how did you not wake up? Obviously, the camper doesn't know what to say. So Grant asks him, are you a heavy sleeper? And the camper says, I don't think so, but I think this is some kind of warning. Grant says, why? Did you piss somebody off? But again, he says, I don't think so. Well, since he wasn't getting anything useful from the camper, Grant thought he'd just move on to the next task at hand, figuring out who is missing sheep. It is certainly possible that 4 sheep had staged a prison break, gone out on the run, and been taken out by a dog or a couple of foxes. Stranger things have happened around there, but not many as strange as the way his day was shaping up. It actually didn't take Grant long to find the farm where the 4 missing sheep had come from. So he drives over to have a word with the farmer and to check the guy's fences. Now, we're already at weird with the dead sheep stew on the camper's front lawn. But this next part is where the whole story takes a hard left toward Freaky Town. The farmer tells Grant that 4 of his sheep had indeed gone missing from the farm. But not all last night. Over the past 2 weeks, one would just disappear randomly every couple of nights. In fact, the farmer says, please check the fences. Be my guest. I have been beefing them up for the last 2 weeks, but I can't figure out how they're getting out. Grant is in no way a sheep fencing expert, but he gives the fences a check anyway. And just like the farmer had said, he'd turned the place into a Fort Knox of wood stakes and chicken wire. After Grant gives him the nod on his handiwork, the farmer says, "I think someone's stealing them. But for the life of me, I can't figure out how." A sheep going missing is an irritatingly common occurrence. But 4 sheep going missing over the course of 2 weeks, then all turning up in the exact same location, looking like they'd each swallowed a hand grenade? You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to know that something odd is going on. But they never figured out what. The campsite is cleaned up, and a wildlife expert stops by and tells Grant that the sheep were too shredded to properly analyze. They would never know if it was an animal or a person that had done those horrible things. When the farmer heard exactly how his sheep had died, he wanted an investigation into the camper for animal cruelty. Can't really blame him, but 4 dead sheep don't really make a big blip on the local police's radar. And the camper was in the wind, so there was no arresting or questioning him. And the Park Service has enough on its plate without having to investigate sheep murders. But still, Grant is mystified. There's obviously something more to the whole thing, yet everyone but him and a handful of his fellow rangers either don't know enough or don't care enough to actually investigate properly. Everyone up the ranger chain of command wants to chalk it up to a spike in the local fox population. But no one who actually witnessed the carnage up at that campsite would be dumb enough to claim that foxes did that. The only real feedback or reaction they got from the National Trust was, "Keep an eye out for any large escaped dogs and any other such predators." They all found that last part a bit scary, but it made no difference in the end. There was no hellhound-type creature romping around the Mourne Mountains, but no investigation meant that they would never figure out what was. Of all the things that Grant has seen or experienced during his time working for the National Trust, the incident with the dead sheep is the one thing that still sends shivers down his spine. But it's not what he knows about it that scares him. It's what he doesn't know that keeps him up at night. And if you want even more strange and mysterious park ranger stories, click here. Be careful out there, and we will see you again on the In-Between.